IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. Do you remember last year when we spoke about how the Intel vPro platform is built for business? Well, I'm glad to say we've kicked it up a notch. That's right, Intel is back with a new and improved version of the platform. The new Intel vPro platform lets you do more of what you want and less of what you don't. So it's better for you and for your IT teams, who really are the backbone of keeping your work-from-home experience easy and enjoyable. I can safely say that the new vPro platform gives you more enterprise efficiency with less constraints. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can get more done with less waiting. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Today I have with me Prateek and Rohan, and we're going to discuss about should India have its own social media content moderation rules at all. So here we go. And the first thing that probably we need to understand is why is there a sudden need for social media content moderation while it's been, this long and this far that we have come without any moderation. So I would like to hear from Rohan.
Yeah, thanks, Soumya. I want to start off by actually looking at why this issue is relevant today. And that's because very recently, Economic Times, their tech page came up with this report saying that officials in the government have been considering coming up with their own rules on content moderation. And I think it's a very important topic to discuss because the reason all of this came about is that one of these officials, they're unnamed in the report, of course, and one of them actually said that, listen, when this Ram Mandir incident happened, and so they happened to be on Twitter, and they just said that Twitter has labeled this thing as controversial. So that triggered some sort of a debate within the ministry, the concerned ministry. I think it's the Ministry of Electronics and IT, and they basically said that, listen, there needs to be some sort of standard set of content moderation guidelines, and that's where I think this relevance comes in. So my personal issue on all of this is that the way this is being taken up is actually a bit problematic because it's such a nuanced field with such a rich history of what to do and what not to do. And if you're going to go ahead with this sort of standard set of rules for content moderation, I don't think it's a great idea. I've addressed this in my column earlier last week. In the spirit of me plugging my columns in Takshila's podcasts, I'll do that again. So do read my column. And Prateek, do you want to build on this?
Yeah, if I can just add to that, right? There are a couple of aspects here. So one is, the ask is for a broader set of rules across a platform, right? So it's basically a consistent set of rules that apply in the country. And some of it is also driven by these recent hate speech allegations and, the story that the Wall Street Journal broke about Facebook. Some of it is driven out of that. And then there's the example that Rohan gave as well, right? And there is this now need to have consistency across platforms, right? And I think it's a very interesting question because look, the way it works today is different platforms define their own policies, they do their own things, right? But what happens is that in the real world, incidents sort of play out across platforms. So what happens is when you have someone who says something that can be considered hate speech on one platform, he gets taken down on that particular platform. Right? Let's just say something, we can actually take a real world example. There was this account of a user called Hindustani Bhau, where he posted some hateful content. On Instagram, there was a lot of pushback on Twitter or on Instagram. His account was reported, etc. Finally, his Instagram account was taken down, but Facebook and Twitter remained. Right, and then after some more, general raising of objections on social media and screaming and shouting, etc., his Facebook account was taken down as well. Right now, that's what happened. Right, a lot of these things are driven by moral outrages. Right, there isn't a consistent set of rules or policies on what defines how should platforms act in these circumstances. Right now, I'm partly with Rohan in the sense that this is an extremely nuanced issue. It's hard to really come up with a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. But you can also see from where the ask for consistency is coming and why there might be some grounds on which to consider it. Right now, we will get more into that as it goes on. But I think that's just to address the larger question of, is this something that we should dismiss completely? Maybe there is sense in having some sort of conversation around.
I want to actually add two things here. The first is that there's some merit in trying to understand where this whole argument of let things be comes from. And so if you read this book called The 26 Words That Created the Internet, excellent book, by the way, I'd recommend it. It basically says that, look, at the time this content moderation debate was coming up, you had this whole sense that the internet is still a very new field, right? And we don't know how this is going to develop. So let platforms handle how they want to monitor content. This law, Section 230, comes into place, and it's ahead of its time, needless to say. And what basically ends up happening is that it gives platforms, it basically gives the internet the shape that it has today. And you see so many times the websites taking advantages of this. I mean, I would argue that Facebook is the logical end to this argument, which is that, look, there's just so much user content, like that's the most this particular section could have been exploited to its full logical extent. Anyway, and the other thing also here is that, look, it's not an easy job. I understand that platforms, even though they have their policies, are not always consistent in implementing them. And this comes from another book that I've read recently, which is Custodians of the Internet by Tarleton Gillespie. I hope I'm not completely butchering his name. But so the way the current system exists is because the internet was defined to be this way. And just because the internet now is a lot more defined than it was back when this law was put into place, doesn't mean that these protections have to go away, because as of right now, these seem to be the best solution. Because if you look at the column that I talked about, that I mentioned earlier, the idea is that, look, the internet is a very diverse space and all platforms moderate. So I'm talking the App Store from Apple moderates, Facebook moderates, Instagram moderates, Amazon moderates. So there's a reason why you don't see porn apps on the App Store, right? Or on the Play Store. Similarly, there's a reason why you don't see a bunch of random things coming up on Amazon all the time. So there is some amount of moderation happening everywhere. So if you want to have a standard set of rules for all platforms, it's difficult because platforms are just inherently different in nature. And secondly, the thing is that people can interpret it's something that can be hate speech or should be moderated for X, shouldn't be moderated for Y. For example, the person in the ministry who thought that the Ram Mandir comment from Twitter was controversial. I mean, someone else could have read the same comment and thought that, well, yeah, it is controversial, so it seems fair. So there's no set standard for what content should exactly be moderated, and there's also no set sense for where this would apply, because platforms inherently are so different.
Yeah, as a quick aside, I think you mentioned Jeff Kosseff's 26 words that created the internet, right? But look at the way things are right now. It's I think he himself joked that the 26 words that confused the internet.
Yeah, so there's some truth in that, but so he also mentioned in this book that the Senator Ron Wyden, who came up with this, who partly came up with this bill, basically also said in a speech towards the end of this book, saying that, listen, we gave you this immunity, right? We gave you Section 230. It's this immunity that you exercise all the time that allows you to exist. He was talking to platforms directly at some content moderation conference, and he basically says that, listen, it may have made sense at the time, but you haven't done a lot with this immunity, as in you haven't actually been responsible in proportion to the power that you've been given. So you better clean up your act because there's every chance that this particular immunity can be taken away. So I don't think even the creators of this law are sort of completely on board with how it's being used. But at the same time, if there is a better solution, I haven't at least heard of it.
All right. I think we started off with setting the context. And of course, you did bring about the trigger for this. And we've probably touched on all the social media channels and how it's shaping up and why there is a need. But how should we even go about it? Like, if you were to kind of give some inputs on, how should this probably be managed so that, I know we can't control the kind of hate speech that's out there. And like you said, moderation only can be possible to some extent. But is there anything that you can suggest or think about which should be the way to go ahead?
Well, I think we were talking before this podcast, right before we began recording. My basic argument is that, look, right now the system that's in place seems to be essentially working. The thing is that everyone seems to think that we're moderating too much or too little. But as far as solutions are concerned, a lot of them aren't either feasible or just don't exist. I've heard some calls from from the US to regulate this. There's the Earn It Act, a few that I forgot. But in general, we crave a lot about this system, but the sheer number of things that it manages right now is underappreciated. So I'd say, in my head at least, there isn't a better way to do this. And so I think the status quo at least seems like the way to go to me.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting, and I think I'll probably diverge a little bit over here because, as you said, right, quoting from Tarleton Gilles's Facebook, that content moderation is the very essence of what a lot of these platforms do. But then, if you go back historically, there are situations where they've come together and tried to solve problems. Right, an example of that was with child sexual abuse material, right, where essentially Microsoft created this photo DNA system that allows companies to get to, that allows you to essentially fingerprint content that has been identified as such, and then you can prevent its proliferation on these platforms. Right now, that is typically touted as a success of platforms working together and in quotes, consistent set of rules across platforms, even though that's not exactly how it translates on the ground, right? Different platforms choose how to act differently, but they have a sort of a common database where they can go to. Now, using this example, this was then extended, right? And I think researchers sort of call this censorship creep, right? Where you have the ability to censor content in one sense, and that it's going to then be applied and extended into different forms of content. Right now, again, with CSAM, I think there is very little disagreement on the fact that it's bad and it should not be allowed on platforms. Right, but a similar logic was ported to extremist content. Right, I think it's called TVEC, or terrorist and violent extremism content. Some of this was expedited by the Christchurch call and the unfortunate Christchurch massacre. But even before that, platforms had been coming together and applied a similar set of solutions, and they created the GIF-CT, right, which is now being spun out into an independent organization. But a lot of what's happening here again is that you can argue that, look, in most cases, there is no logic under which you should be sharing violent extremist content, right? But even there, now it's a little trickier than CSAM, because in certain cases you can argue for research it might make sense to share or store that data, right? Or you can say years after the fact, when you're trying to demonstrate or make a point, there is some value in sharing that sort of content. So it's not as open and close a case as let's say CSAM is, but it's still probably easier to come to a consensus to, right? Now, the same argument again is being extended even further, and it's being said, hey, let's apply this in the case of disinformation. Maybe we can do something similar in the case of hate speech, right? All these companies come together and define standards or define norms, and this is being called and I think the term, and I'm going to borrow from Evelyn Douek's work on this, is that she calls this essentially a content cartel, where you have a lot of these companies coming together and defining, there is a call for them to come together and work and define these norms. There are some advantages, even though they've traditionally stayed away from doing something like this. It does offer them some advantages, right? In the sense that it sort of helps them spread accountability across, right? When you have a coalition of companies making these sort of decisions, there isn't any one person to hold, or any one company to hold accountable, right? It's sometimes easier to take unpopular decisions, or in general, right? Even if it's not necessarily an unpopular decision, there is less accountability, right? The other issue with a lot of these mechanisms, turns out, is that often happens is that there is very little transparency or accountability built in, because as typically a civil society orgs or the public in general does not know what's happening when these guys are essentially private, they're private bureaucracies that govern speech, right? And you have very little insight into how they're working with each other. And we've already seen this happen, right? In the case of some coordinated activity that platforms have gotten together and taken down, they've all independently come out and said, Twitter was working on this. We got a tip off. We took it down from our own platform, right? But that's all Facebook said in that instance. Twitter in the same instance that I'm talking about was, I think it was activity from China, right? Twitter on their part went out and put out information in terms of the accounts they've taken down. Turns out some of the decisions that they had taken were in error, and they were called out for it. But people like Google and Facebook, who absolutely shared no information about what they actually did, got away with it, right? So we're also creating that incentive for them to be less transparent about such decisions. Right. So whether we believe that the status quo is working or not, I think the calls for them to be doing something are getting louder and louder. And it seems likely that platforms are going to they are going to work together. Right. We saw this with even with COVID-19. A lot of them stepped into trying to deal with misinformation, disinformation more actively than they have before, and then ran into the same set of problems. In the sense because it got so polarized and politicized.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that a little. I think they could do more, but that element of them being able to do more can only possibly stem from a system that allows collaboration and cooperation. Because if we, let's say, for example, if the state comes up with particular guidelines, it complicates a lot of things because not all platforms, they won't apply to all platforms. And coordination sort of becomes harder because some platforms can basically, guidelines keep evolving time to time, and the state may not be as, let's say, as responsive to these developments. So it might be a challenge. And so even in the paper that we wrote, we saw that platforms were sort of playing a more proactive role when it came to COVID-19 misinformation. But I'd just like to point out that even that, let's say, more proactive role is only possible, it can only be built upon the current status quo that exists, because had the state come up with content moderation guidelines, I'm sure it would have been more of a challenge for them to update them with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, because it wouldn't be as responsive.
No, that's fair, and just to be clear, there is a distinction between the state making rules and a set of consistent rules across platforms, right? So, I think we're probably both in agreement that this is not necessarily that you shouldn't have the state defining these rules per se, but there is probably some merit in considering that maybe you can have some set of consistent rules across the platform, but what that is going to be extremely difficult, right? Because again, as you were saying, content moderation at scale is very hard to do. In fact, pretty much impossible.
Yeah, the scale is the problem.
Yeah, exactly, right. The scale is a problem, and the other issue is that sometimes it also gets positioned as an issue of, hey, you have four big platforms who will then make the rules for everyone else, right? And I think that's also a potential issue there, right? Because and I think this is something you point out in your column as well, that it will affect. They're essentially going to be setting the standards, right, for other companies to operate, and you're sort of increasing barriers to entry there. On the flip side of it, right, because this is tech policy and we love our trade-offs, that also means the more decentralized the system is, the harder it is to coordinate, right? So if you have, let's say, something that you know what you want to be taken down, if you have 5 big platforms, you can potentially coordinate faster and take it down, as opposed to a larger set of, a much larger industry or a much larger set of a tier 2, tier 3 kind of platform, right? And we've seen that. So I think there's this very interesting information operation called secondary infection, right, which was operating across 300 platforms over 6 years, right? So, I mean, it's going to be very hard to challenge or to stop something like that from happening, no matter how consistent your rules are.
Yeah.
Great. I think it's interesting how you're also talking about all the platforms, coming and collaborating together, and maybe the outcomes will be better. But given that most of the social media platforms have its own entry barriers of sorts, right? And there are filters to ensure, things from hate speech to other things can be traced back. Do you think because of different geographies, right? Say, forget the Indian context, but globally also, because the audience here who are consuming the content are all over the place. So do you think anything to do with regulations, which probably will form up India's regulation policy, if that happens, is going to, probably be a great pushback, because others will still continue to have the luxury of, quoting, writing what they want, but there will be a stiff regulated body which will kind of keep a close watch on what's happening in an Indian context.
If I've understood your question correctly, it's that, well, if we have a body here, and that means for a different social media for India, how that would shape things. My main argument to that would be that I don't see why we need to. I mean, even if we did have a body, it would be extremely hard for them to enforce rules that apply through all of the internet. I'm not just talking about Facebook, even though that's a big part of it. I'm also talking about Reddit, Twitter, and any other platform that people interact on. So I think having a body wouldn't necessarily be a solution to anything, because enforcement at scale is going to be impossible. And as I said before in this podcast, the scale is the challenge. So having a body necessarily doesn't solve for much. I mean, it can maybe identify 3 or 4 cases that shouldn't have happened and lay out guidelines for future cases. But the thing with content moderation is that the textbook cases also aren't the problem. Okay, it's the edge cases. And even if you argue that edge cases are 1 in a million, that still means just on Twitter that 500 edge cases coming up per day. On Facebook, even more. And so I would say that having a body that regulates speech on social media, I don't know how they would regulate speech at all, because if Facebook isn't able to impose proper guidelines for speech all the time, with all its massive resources, I don't know how a government body how successful they'd be at doing this.
No, and I think, Swami, your question also pointed out that if let's say you come up with some rules in India and those are enforced, how will that play in the global context, right? And I think that's an interesting thing, because that is going to it's going to be difficult to enforce. It's still not going to be impossible to enforce from a technical standpoint, right? You can potentially do that. Of course, there will be hundreds of ways to work around something like that, and it will create, as you said, this situation where. Again, we're assuming that, let's say we're in a situation where on Facebook, users in India can't say XYZ things, but users from different countries can say the same thing, right? And you're effectively posting on the same platform. So that will create a lot of issues. That's going to create an uneven field for sure, even if, you're able to technically achieve that. But what's also going to happen is that the problem with companies maybe not wanting to do something like that is, once they do it in one country, there is going to be a push from various countries to do something similar, right? So that it's going to be ultimately a choice that they take, because if you do, I think it's expected, right? If they enforce something like this for India, there are going to be a lot of countries that are going to have similar asks, and then you're also then going into this whole cyber sovereignty access, right? Where cyber sovereignty conversation, where essentially creating sort of borders for the internet, right? Are we basically going to say, hey, look, Facebook users in India can only interact with other Facebook users in India. You cannot have anyone else, you can't have content from other countries visible in India, right? Now, that may be possible. It's my nightmare scenario, but it can happen.
Okay, great. Thanks, Prateek and Rohan. But if there's anything else that you would like to add on for our concluding remarks, I would like to hear it from you guys.
Sure. My concluding remark is we'll link the column in the show notes. Please go through it and do write to us if you think that this is interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'll add is that, look, content moderation is a hard problem, and I think we're probably not going to get anywhere if we try to solve potentially for every problem every case to be solved absolutely correctly. So there are always going to be errors. It's about us, picking out which errors we want to solve for. I think that's probably what we have to keep in mind as we go forward in this important conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Prateek and Rohan, for being on this. And I would like to tell our listeners that we have the Deep Webinar 3 that's happening on the China Challenge this week. So we have the webinar lined up on this Friday, 7 to 8 p.m. IST. And if you're interested, do take a look at our events page. And the topic for this one is an economic divorce possible at all in the China Challenge? So look forward to have you all tune into it and do register. Thanks once again, Prateek and Rohan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Soumya.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Intel, for coming back to us. We love our sponsors. If you'd like to be one of them, do reach out. So really, really cool week on the network this week, right? Started off with a bang. Abhijit Ganguly was on Cyrus Says. Funny comedian. I think you guys will enjoy that. We had Dimant Parekh on Advertising is Dead. Dimant's the founder of Better India. Govindraj Athiraj is also on Uncle Please Sit this week. That's a really fascinating show which they talk about fake news. On The Habit Coach, there was a crossover event with Aditi Surana from Absolutely Right. I think you definitely enjoyed that. And last but not least, definitely a show I'd love you all to check out. We have a new show called This Round Is On Me. It's hosted by Gauri Devi Dayal. If you remember, Gauri and I worked on a show together called The Kolaba Cartel a while ago. Fun show. If you haven't checked that out, do check that out. But this is a show where she's talking to a lot of different people in the food space. Her first guest is Harsh Mariwala, legend in his own time. I think you'll really, really enjoy that show. But with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.